Lord, just come to you right now. Just beseech your blessings on this class. Just pray that each one of us here will be wide-eyed, attentive, and listen to the words that Glenn is going to bring us this morning. And let Glenn parcel those words in a way that won't appear as it does on the screen up there this morning. Let truth be truth. Let law be law. And let love be love. And just pray with Glenn that he can bring us a message that will affect our lives. Give us a message that we can take home with us and live through it. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your presence. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Father, we pray that you will resolve the situation in Congo, that your power will be known there, that your mighty angels will defeat the powers of the enemy, that the people, that the voice of people will be heard, that true justice will be realized, and most of all, Father, that those who want to proclaim good news may have the opportunity and the voice and the power to do so. That will all be to your glory. In Jesus' name. Last week I was going to remind Bill that if there's ever a time that there's not food, but, down in the Youth and Family Center, they'll be glad to sell you some. It's part of their fundraising effort is they have food there that they sell to the generally ravenous teenagers, but occasionally ravenous adults. Yes, this is an implied confiscation up here. So you may have heard the story about W.C. Fields, who was far from a reverend man, known for his great irreverence, was seen late in life reading the Bible. And he was asked, what was he doing? Looking for loopholes. And the fact is, if he truly read it, he would have found that many people of like minds throughout Scripture, looking for loopholes. There are a number of examples that can be found in Scripture of people looking around either the way the law spoke or to work around vows that they had made without considering the implications of it. One that I'll mention briefly was there was this terrible scene in the Old Testament where a man trying to appease the lust of the men of Gibeah left his maidservant there for them to have at, and they did. And basically, they raped her to death. And when he saw this, he didn't know how to respond, so he ended up cutting her body apart and sending apart to each of the other 11 tribes. Gibeah was in the tribe of Benjamin. And they came and they were ready to destroy the city, and Benjamin wouldn't turn people over. And I won't get into all of what happened there, but it was the rest of Israel took a vow. We will not give our daughters in marriage to anyone from the tribe of Benjamin. And if we do, God's going to have it out on us. In other words, they took this vow before God that they would not allow their daughters to marry into the tribe of Benjamin. So what does that mean for Benjamin? They suddenly realized, one way or another, we just gave the tribe of Benjamin a death sentence. Because they can't marry their own daughters. This becomes incestuous relationships. They can't do that. But then the only other option they have is to marry outside of the people of Israel, which is also a violation of God's will and a death sentence. So what do? They started trying to find a workaround, a way around the vow they took. And first it was, they sort of let the people of Benjamin know, well, some of our virgin women are going to be dancing this grove, and if you should happen to find them there, nobody's going to do anything about it. And so this happened. There still wasn't enough women, and then they found another workaround and say there was one particular town that would not participate in the vendetta against Gibeah and against Benjamin, and they said, all right, you can have any of the virgin women in that town. But this was their workaround. They did not give their daughters. The people who took the vow did not give their daughters. They allowed some to be taken. They volunteered others that didn't take the vow. But it was a workaround. And that happens a lot. And we know, we hear in our own law tax loopholes. And generally there it's said that every time they close one loophole, the door is open somewhere else. The people who try to find some way of working around and manipulating the law. Anyone who's familiar with works of Shakespeare, in the Merchant of Venice, a loophole was exploited to protect the protagonist, because the protagonist had made an agreement, entered a contract with Shylock, who was the evil character in this, and oh, by the way, was a Jew, and some of Shakespeare's expectation there, that if he failed to keep his bargain and the contract failed, that Shylock could take a pound of flesh from his body. Sort of says he's going to die, got a pound of flesh out of his body. Well, just when this event is about to happen, one of the other characters, actually the woman, the love interest, who came disguised as a lawyer, said, oh yes, but you may have his pound of flesh. But nothing was said about blood. If you spilled any blood, excising your pound of flesh, then you're going to forfeit all your possessions and all everything you own, because of the way the law here is written. So this was the loophole. How do you extract a pound of flesh without spilling blood? Not possible. Well, in Jewish law, there were many loopholes. I was sharing this with a couple earlier. You had the Torah, which was the Mosaic law as stated and given, but then there were written records. The Mishnah and later the Gemara, but they all made what's referred to as the Talmud explanations, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And over time, even the explanations became given the force of the law. The rabbis, in fact, we're going to get into some of this in a few minutes, but the rabbis would in fact consider their opinions, their statements about the law, what the law means, or explanations of the law, to carry the same force that the law of Moses carried, if not more. So they put their opinions on the same plane as the law of God. And this is really where Jesus had most of his conflicts with the Pharisees. Not just about law, but their traditions, their opinions, and their loopholes. There are a couple of loopholes. Is Stuart here? Stuart's not here this morning. A couple of loopholes that are very prominent even today. One is that a married woman, Orthodox Jewish woman, is, when she's out in public, supposed to have her head covered. But what's a head covering? There's a thriving business of very beautiful and elaborate wigs. It's not her hair. It could be somebody else's hair. It could be artificial hair, but it's a covering. Meets the letter of the law. May not meet the spirit of the law. But there's great business in that, for several centuries now. Now, when it first introduced, the rabbis fought it, resisted it, but eventually it became accepted, and it's not really appreciated, but there are a number of places that this is part of their practice. The head covering is a wig. a head covering that doesn't look like a head covering. Or there's another workaround or loophole called eruv. One of the big issues with the law was what's work. And Jesus and the Pharisees went at it on this many times. What's work? How do you define work? And there were many different ways that work was defined in the Mishnah and in other Talmudic writings. You know, what could you carry? How far could you walk? What could you do? And there were things that were permitted in a private setting. For instance, picking up your child inside the house, that was fine. But if you went 6 feet outside your door, you couldn't. Because then you're going into a public setting. So moving a chair, moving a piece of furniture was work, but it's allowed in the private setting according to the rabbis, but not outside. Carrying a box was work. It was allowed in the private setting, not outside, not in the public setting. Well, the eruv is a neat little workaround where a public space is declared private. They set a specific boundary. Very often it will be an existing physical boundary. And sometimes it's aided by other things. For instance, in the cities now, sometimes it'll be this line, this telephone line that far, and oh, there's no telephone line there, so we'll run fishing line from here to there, and then back, and so, but they define a boundary, and it's declared eruv. This is now private space. Eruv means mixed, blended. So this is mixed space, and if you're in an eruv, you can carry that burden. You can push your child's you can push your child or pick up your child. You can do various things within bounds that would be considered work, but since this is now private space, you can do it legally. It's a workaround. It's a loophole. And apparently last year, some of the Orthodox Jewish community managed to establish to get about half of Manhattan declared as an eruv. We laugh, but it's humorous that they're trying to find it. But in reality is, how do you take a centuries-old law that was written in a time where you didn't travel far in your lifetime anyway, and it was an agrarian society, and most of the work had to do with farming or taking care of your animals or moving heavy things related to your... And so you take that and move it into our society today, and how do you make it work? And so yes, it's really growing things out in unusual ways, but they're trying to find a practical way to observe law in a society in a culture that doesn't know anything about Torah. I can poke fun, but on the other hand, I know that there are reasons for that. And I can also poke fun at ourselves in many areas. First time I tried an extended fast. Now I'll say this, I have had to train myself to not have food as soon as I get up out of bed in the morning. I'm one of these people that early, it used to be I would begin to feel sick. I would begin to feel ill because of my stomach. It's not that there was really anything wrong. My stomach would complain. I feel kind of lightheaded and so I've had to discipline myself to wait longer at times and learn that. But the first time we did an extended fast, I'm drinking water. Well, what about milk? It's not solid food. Well, what about a milkshake? Smoothie. How far do you extract this out? And find a loophole. And there are a lot of different ways that we do that at times, and play games. And as I've mentioned, Jesus' biggest arguments at times with Pharisees were not about Torah. About what are you doing with the law? A few weeks ago, the practice of Korban was mentioned during one of Pete's lessons. Korban was where you could say, well, this money is dedicated to God. Because it's dedicated to God, because it's been given to God, well, no, I don't have to give it to my parents. And, maybe they need food. And Jesus, what are you doing? You're working around God. You're ignoring God's commandment to honor your father and mother and care for your father and mother by saying, oh, this money will be given to God. How better to give it to God than take care of your parents? And of course, the irony of that is I didn't actually have to physically turn it over. They can still be in possession of the money, but just declare it's been given to God. One of the loopholes, and by the way, I'm going to jump to throw some Latin up here. Not that I'm a Latin person, but I think the literal just means maximum law, maximum injustice, but more law, less justice. What was happening here is the laws grew and grew and grew and grew, and we have it in our own culture too, in our own society. And it's not that although I guess I might be considered to have libertarian leanings in some respects. I'm not necessarily libertarian, but I am a person that believes that the more the government does in terms of the law, the more trouble we're in. And I'm not trying to preach that. That's my opinion. Although I know where many laws are beneficial. But at times, the more law there is, the less justice there is. I worked with we have any attorneys here. I worked with a young woman who was brilliant, and she was top of her class in college, and went into law school, and after a year, dropped out. And I asked her why. Because she was number one in her class in law school. She said, because I realized the law is not just. And so she was not going to have a part of an industry where you were promoting something that was inherently not just. And so, sort of her call. Well, the thing that particularly pertains to what we've been discussing in terms of sabbatical year and jubilee year is a loophole. And I put this question before you last week. Why was it hard for it to happen? What were the things that truly prevented people from enacting, or made them feel like they couldn't enact the Sabbath year or the Jubilee year? Any thoughts? Okay, Bill?
The basic difficulty, I think, is in human selfishness. And that boils down to, I have an asset in this slave that I've bought, or in this property that I've acquired, and in either the seventh year or the Jubilee year, I got to give it all back for free and not expect anything back for it. Well, from my human logic standpoint, that's about the dumbest thing in the world to do. But from God's standpoint, it was a wonderful thing to do.
Okay. Now, before back here, there's a little irony in that view. I mean, a lot of irony, but one. How did you determine the price of property when property was going to be sold or change hands? It wasn't really sold, but we didn't spend a lot of time in the text with that, but it was in the text.
Based on years of production.
Based on years of production. So if you bought it the first year after the Sabbath year, then you had 6 years of produce. Fifth year, you had 2 years. And so the price was based on how much production you were going to get. So it really wasn't that there was, it may or may not be an enormous investment. But during all that time, you were getting getting the privilege of using this property. But yes, that's one of the, there's, greed. Why do I, what else? Any other thought? Yes.
I think one of the biggest problems with it would be your faith, that you would still have provision during that year without working, without having crops, without, that God would provide enough for those 3 years.
That's right. Even though, it's a question, do you believe God's promise? He said, trust me, I will give you in the 6th year what you need for the 7th, the 8th, and into the 9th. We've got a couple here and back there, so.
I think this is an area ripe for group speak, where one person is thinking about, I think I'm going to follow the year of Jubilee, but he looks around and none of his other cronies are going to do it. And so he rationalizes in mind, well, no one else is going to do it, then I'm going to get poorer in relation to all the other associates that I have. So this just doesn't make any sense. So, it's very hard for one isolated incident to follow God's law there.
And even though the whole purpose was to prevent that disparity in wealth, we hear a lot in our culture about the growing disparity between the rich and the poor, and we see it, we realize it, generational poverty, and yet God's intent there was to prevent that from happening.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but I understand that the debts were to be forgiven, correct?
Yes.
So I'm thinking if I have been a lender and I'm, expecting these people to pay me back, that I'm thinking maybe by forgiving debts, I myself may be thrown into kind of a bad financial situation.
Yeah, and that's a human thought, and I think that is one of the driving things. And again, God, and this is why you're on target. All these answers are on target. But where it falls down is God said, one of the teachings was, don't lend more than you can afford to. Only what you can let go of do you lend. Of course, that gets down to the question of what do I need. Occasionally, I jokingly, a friend of mine and I used to work with, we'd call it retirement plan. Occasionally buy a lottery ticket. Especially when it's, when the pot is bigger than the odds against winning, that's when I'm going. And the odds against winning 300 million to 1 or something. But what do you need? And not that I believe in labor, I'll never win one of those things. I already have a commitment, I'll voice the commitment here, that it will be at least a reverse tithe. Let's say you win $100 million in the lottery. What do you need? So my commitment already is at least $90 million of that being given away. And probably a lot more than that. What do I need? And I already know, I've got the phone number of the person at Pioneer Bible Translators, who's the Director of Development. If that ever happens, he's the first person I call. Help me figure out how to do this. Help me is there a way to assign ownership to you and to Christian Relief Fund and others so you just get it up front without tax, before tax, or is it better to put it in, how do I manage this? It's a plan. Now, do I ever expect to enact the plan? The odds are so, it's impossible. But what do you need? And part of God's question there is, what do you need? But don't lend more than you can afford. And don't despise your brother. No, good. Yeah.
I guess maybe lack of discipline to put back what the Lord has blessed you with in that 6th year for the 7th year. Just like, I guess, I realize retirement's coming up and I should have been putting back, through the years, and if you're, the lack of discipline, you tend to spend more than you should, so that might be one of the problems.
Spend more than you should, plus get out of work too many stinking times. Yeah, but it's a part of discipline. It's a discipline and trust. And any of these things, the fast is a discipline. Yes?
I think everything that's been talked about so far can be narrowed down to pride.
Yeah?
It's what we, the fear of losing something because we have so much. And we have, if we lose something we have, then it addresses our basic pride that we, whether it's a lottery win and people can spend it all or give it all away, but it still has to do of a lack of humility or a pride issue.
By the way, one time I told Pete about that thing about the lottery, at least reverse tithe. He said, "Oh, I need to start praying that you win the lottery." But that's, again, sort of a humorous thing. Well, we're going to move on here, but all these answers are correct. But it comes down to pride, it comes down to trust, it comes down to greed, but it also comes down to love. How do you perceive your brother? How do you perceive the person who's in need? Remember, this person is needing money because they've hit hard times. No one's going to be asking for a loan if they don't need it. No one's going to be offering up the sale or release of their property to someone else unless they're just in a desperate situation. So it was all a matter of need and a matter of respect and realizing what people are looking at. Well, one of the reasons I started off with this question of loophole, we're talking about loophole, is that Hillel the Elder, who was the grandfather of Gamaliel, you may remember, was the person who taught Saul, as a Pharisee, came up with this decree called prosbul. And the prosbul was a way of dealing with this obstacle of not lending. Because he saw the wealthy don't want to let go of their money. They're concerned about losing their investment. They're just concerned about giving it away, loaning people and then having to forgive the debt. Now the assumption was people were supposed to pay back all they could. They were supposed to be paying back. If you borrowed, let's say you borrowed seed, because that was one of the things you could borrowed seed for a crop, then out of part of the crop that you produce, you'd be paying back something. It's not that the debt just went untended. That would be ungodly too. That would be unacceptable before the Lord as well. You were supposed to be making an effort to pay it back. But there was this concern that you didn't want to lend, and because they would look at this, and as we've pointed out, they were concerned about doing it, but on one hand, it just hurt the poor. Excuse me, my mind's running someplace else for a moment. Hurt the poor, and it disobeyed God. And actually, believe it or not, I think that's the order God would perceive, would rank the problem. He was much more concerned about whether they were going to hurt the poor than about whether they were obeying him. And he wanted their obedience. But he would be concerned about hurting the poor. And so Hillel introduced this treatise. And we'll get into a little bit of the rabbis and the treatises here in a few minutes, but in this case, it was something that says, translates basically before the court, or before the administrator. And what prosbul did was it allowed a person to transfer private debt to the public administration. So I've loaned money, Fourth year, you're paying back. Fifth year, you're paying back. The sixth year, you're paying back. There's still a debt out there. Well, before the seventh year came, before the seventh year ended, I could transfer this debt to a court, essentially a debtor's court, for them to worry about it. It's no longer mine to be concerned with. The problem here was the court, which is not your neighbor, is not your friend, not your brother, is not bound by the law. And so the court didn't forgive the debt. The court wasn't, it was perceived that the court was under that obligation. Then after the seventh year was over, if you wanted to, you could bring the debt back under your control, or you could leave it with the court. So what happens here is, yeah, the poor are getting money loaned to them, but the debt is never being forgiven. Sort of like school loans, you know. I will say this once. I believe, you know, of course, the government will never do this. I believe the single thing that our government could do to help the economy is to forgive the interest, not the principal. Forgive the interest on every federal student loan. And I'm seeing back there, back there. Because people will be able to pay them off. But the way they're structured, our children, or we, you know, the debt's going to be there when we die. Because the way it happens, and that's the same principle here. Here, the debt's never forgiven. So yeah, the poor have money to work with, but they don't have any opportunity for relief. So even though it was intended to help the poor, because that was Hillel's stated purpose. This is to help the poor, make it where people will go in and lend rather than withhold it. It doesn't help them at all. And so they never got relief. They never got the results they needed. Now, interestingly enough, some of the other rabbis who defended Prose Bowl, and how they came to this, I'm not sure, believed that forgiving the debts was harmful to the lenders. And so they justified Hillel's position. I said, well, yeah, really, it was bad for the lenders to begin with, so there shouldn't be. Would God put a law in place that was bad for anyone? So that's the question I have there. And yet here are the rabbis, which was the teachers of law, students of law, understand, who had this deep knowledge, would say, oh, it's bad for the lenders. Certainly that's not what God intended. I have an issue with that.
It's kind of following what Jesus said. He said, "Give, expect nothing in return." It's kind of overriding the thought.
Okay. And we actually can look at that very thing. You know, he was just jumping ahead to Jesus saying, give and expect nothing in return. One of the things we're going to do today is look at some of the things that Jesus taught that I believe directly apply to this law, or to this expectation. The other problem was this: since this debt now belonged to the court rather than to a human being, well, there are fees, there are administrative costs, essentially interest. So they could charge interest, or they could charge fees, which was not according to God's law. And then if the debt was not paid off in time, not repaid, the debtor could end up in prison, essentially a debtor's prison. And although it's not a direct correlation, I believe that Jesus had this in mind when he's saying in the Sermon on the Mount, when you're on the way to court, an adversary, meet with your adversary, resolve it before you get there. Because when you get there, You know they're going to throw you in jail. You're going to be there until somebody pays the debt. That's why I think it ties back to this, because there's financial obligation involved. And you're going to be in prison until someone, presumably the poor family you're trying to support to begin with, pays off this debt. So is it better to, you're just there. You're in debtor's prison. And until someone decides to forgive or release the debt. Here's what God said about interest. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. You shall not charge interest to your countrymen, interest on money, food, or anything that may be loaned at interest. So even if it could be loaned at interest, don't do it. And again, as I mentioned earlier in one of the other classes, God considered it usury, period. We think of usury as exorbitant. But God didn't want interest. When we had first moved back here, Allison had just started teaching, and she had to take a class. And somehow, it was at UNC, I think, or Texas Women, but anyway, taking this class, and somehow, because of the class, even though she was already teaching and already working, got on the list of recent graduates. And she got a credit card offer. Now, this happened to be that at the time I was working on a consulting engagement at the company that made the credit card offer. Almost 30% interest. Expected, for these new students, recent graduates who don't know better, almost 30% interest for this credit card. Obviously, we didn't do that. We're going to do that. But I went to a fellow who was in the credit card division of that company, and I explained what happened, and was expecting him to be concerned about the usury, and his only concern was the wrong person got on the mailing list. Not that they were practicing usury. And that goes on today. Still goes on. And you see news stories very often about the payday loans and all those sort of things. It's just appalling. Well, quickly, who are the rabbis and where did they think this authority came from? According to the Bible, Scripture, what's that? Moses. Well, government came, they said government came through, of course, Moses, but he was the judge. But elders, judges, priests, prophets, and eventually kings. Those were the people who were identified as being arbiters of justice in the land. People who could teach, who could support, who could make assessments of what is right and wrong. And no one other than us. During the Second Temple period, and we mentioned last week, Second Temple was after return from Babylon. The Sanhedrin Council emerged. And the Sanhedrin claims to be linked to those 70 elders, the inheritance of the 70 elders who served with Moses. Sanhedrin was 70 people. And primarily made up of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. A few other sects were involved, but those were the dominant ones, and they fought basically for dominance, for control. And eventually the Pharisees more or less assumed control of the Sanhedrin. On the other hand, by Jesus' time, the Sadducees were the ones who had the high priest and were considered the legal strength in the high priest, but the Sanhedrin also had legal strength. And they primarily looked over religious law, but they were given some civil law provision as well from the Greeks and then later from the Romans. Well, the rabbis emerged from the Pharisees. They came out as they were considered sages, teachers, experts in law. They had to go through strenuous study And not just on the Torah, but on the written explanations of the Torah and the explanations of the explanations. And so they were the masters of the loophole. They knew all the things about what was going on there. And actually they claimed their authority from a passage in Deuteronomy 17 where God said, the Mosaic law said, if there's ever a problem that's too difficult for you to solve, go up to the priest and have the priest bring it before me. And we together will solve this thing. Well, the rabbis claimed that they were the inheritors of that dispensation. As I mentioned, they very often believed that their teaching, their interpretations, their explanations of the law were greater than the law. More important than Torah. If not, at least as important, if not more important. And that's where Jesus had a lot of his issue. And as I had there the last line, no basis in Scripture for the existence. Now, on the other hand, although Jesus said, don't let anyone call you rabbi, he refused to be called rabbi. Don't call anyone rabbi, don't call anyone father, don't call anyone master. He did not entirely refute, excuse me, or reject the teachings of rabbis as a whole. It seemed that he respected, 5 minutes already? Whoa, okay. He respected what they were doing in terms of their study and teaching, but his issue was that they presumed that their teaching was more important than God. And also the burdens that they put on people. Now, we're not going to get as far into this as I thought we would today, but the question is, did Jesus have anything to say about the teachings of the sabbatical year or the Jubilee year? Now, we heard one reference already. Give without considering whether someone's going to give it back to you. But I believe that all through Jesus' teaching, and we're not going to look at every possible place, but all through his teaching, there are examples of this. One of the first ones is there in the Sermon on the Mount, which is that give to him who asks of you. Do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. This is one of the first premises, excuse me, of the sabbatical year. It was time to Lent. And then it was time to forgive. And don't worry about where it's going to go. And quickly, this is the one that you referred to earlier. Luke 6, 27 to 38. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Give to everyone who asks of you. And whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. That was partly pointed at the Roman occupation. The Romans take it from you, don't worry about it, let it go. Or someone more power than you takes something, don't worry about it, let it go. If you love those who love you, if you do good to those who do good to you, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? This is tit for tat. You're expecting something back for what you're doing. Oh, love your enemies. Well, thank you. Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And this is what it looks like. And you will be known as sons of the Most High. Do not judge, do not condemn, but pardon, and the verb there actually means release, which is the whole purpose of the Sabbath year. Release, and you will be released as well. We're starting 2 minutes. I'm I'm not going to jump into the next one because I wanted to take some time with it. I will ask you, we'll let this end in a little early, especially as my voice is going away. Again, I hate allergies. This morning, someone commended mostly Perry, but me a little bit on singing. And he said, you asked me on the praise team. And I said, I can't tell what my voice is going to do week to week. No. But that was kind of her. But I think it was she heard Perry. I'll end with this, and it's sort of, doesn't sound like it's related, but it is. John was in prison, and he heard about what Jesus was doing. And so he asked some of his disciples, go find out what this is about. And they found Jesus and observed his ministry and saw what he was doing. And they said, John wants to know, are you the one who's coming, or should we look for somebody else? As you go back and tell him what you saw. The blind see, the lame walk. Those who need, basically, people are being restored. People are being restored to what God intended. And the good news is being proclaimed to the poor. You go tell John that. Basically, and let John come to his own conclusions. Would you? And blessed be Jesus, don't move with it. But it was a remind John the Messiah was here. Remind John that good news is being proclaimed. Well, thanks for your time today.